You thought you knew how this story ended. You thought it was just another quiet separation, another family drifting apart behind closed doors. But what actually unfolded rewrote everything, because one courtroom entrance, one name, one decision exposed years of silence, imbalance, and hidden choices. And once the first truth surfaced, there was no way to stop what followed. So before you skip, understand this. This is not gossip. This is not drama. This is the moment everything the Browns built began to collapse in public, and every second after that only made it impossible to look away. It was never supposed to unfold like this, because the courtroom was expected to be quiet, procedural, and predictable. Another day of paperwork, restrained expressions, and polite tension. But instead, it became the moment that cracked open a story viewers thought they already understood. Because when the doors opened and Janelle walked in, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Not because of drama, but because of certainty. Her posture was steady, her movement intentional, her expression calm in a way that only comes from someone who has already made peace with the past and chosen the future. And every eye in the room followed her, not out of curiosity, but recognition, because this was not the same woman who once negotiated harmony at her own expense. This was someone who had stepped out of survival mode and into authorship of her own narrative. And even before she spoke, the room sensed that nothing would return to how it was before this moment. Christine noticed first the stillness, the way Janelle did not search for reassurance, did not hesitate, did not soften her presence. Mary felt it too, that quiet understanding that whatever was about to happen could not be undone. And Cody felt it most of all, because power recognizes when it no longer holds the center, and when Janelle introduced herself using a different name, the sound of it landed heavier than any accusation, because names signal transition, and this name marked the end of a long chapter, one defined by compromise, and the beginning of something else entirely. And from that instant forward, the proceedings stopped feeling like a legal formality and started feeling like a reckoning, slowly, deliberately unfolding, as if every unresolved moment from the past decade had queued itself patiently for this exact setting. And as documents were presented, timelines clarified, and patterns emerged, the narrative shifted away from emotion towards structure, because feelings can be dismissed, but records cannot. And what began to surface was not chaos, but clarity, revealing how decisions once framed as necessary had consistently flowed in one direction, how responsibility had been shared unevenly, and how silence had been rewarded with invisibility. And as the room absorbed this information, the tension did not spike, it deepened, because the most unsettling truths are not explosive, they are methodical. And as each layer was revealed, viewers were drawn further in, not by shock alone, but by recognition, because this story echoed something familiar to anyone who has ever been told to wait a little longer, to be patient, to trust the process, while watching others move ahead unchecked. And when another figure in the room came into focus, seated quietly behind Janelle, the energy shifted again, because history has weight, even when it does not announce itself, and recognition crossed faces not as drama, but as memory resurfacing. And the significance of his presence reframed earlier choices, adding context to old disputes and unresolved tensions. And as attention returned to the proceedings, it became clear that this was no impulsive break, but a carefully prepared step, built on years of observation, documentation, and restraint. And that realization kept viewers watching, because the question was no longer what happened, but how far back did it go, and how much had been hidden in plain sight. And as testimony continued, the room moved from disbelief into comprehension, because once enough pieces align, the picture becomes impossible to ignore. And what unfolded was not framed as blame, but as consequence, a natural outcome of imbalance left unaddressed for too long. And that is what made the moment so compelling, because it was not loud or chaotic, it was inevitable. And inevitability holds attention more powerfully than spectacle, because viewers understood that this was only the beginning, that every answer raised another question, and that the full story had not yet finished revealing itself. And so the audience stayed, watching, not waiting for an outburst, but for the next quiet confirmation that everything they thought they knew was about to be redefined. As the hearing pressed forward, the atmosphere grew heavier, not louder, because the most unsettling moments were carried on quiet confirmations rather than raised voices. And every time someone attempted to reassert control, the effort only revealed how fragile that control had always been. And viewers could feel the gravity of that shift, because the room was no longer reacting, it was processing years of unresolved imbalance in real time. And each new piece of testimony did not arrive as a shock, but as an answer to questions that had lingered since the earliest seasons. Questions about why certain sacrifices were always expected from the same people, why financial clarity was promised but rarely delivered, and why harmony always seemed to require silence from those who gave the most. And as the proceedings continued, the narrative expanded beyond a single relationship and into a broader examination of patterns, because what unfolded was not an isolated disagreement, but a system that had rewarded compliance and penalized dissent. And as witnesses spoke and records were reviewed, the story tightened its grip on the audience, because every revelation connected seamlessly to the last, creating a chain that felt both meticulous and unavoidable. And when emotional reactions finally surfaced, they did not distract, they reinforced the weight of what was being acknowledged, because emotion here was not spectacle, it was the byproduct of recognition. And as familiar faces processed the information, viewers could see the internal recalculations happening in real time, moments where past conversations were being reinterpreted and long-accepted explanations were quietly dissolving. And this recalibration kept attention locked, because the audience was undergoing the same process, reevaluating scenes they had watched years earlier and realizing how much context had been missing. And as the courtroom absorbed more detail, it became evident that this was no longer about repairing what had been broken, but about understanding why it had been allowed to fracture for so long. And when accountability finally entered the room, it did not arrive as punishment, it arrived as structure, placing boundaries where ambiguity once lived. And this shift reframed the entire narrative, because the story was no longer driven by emotion, but by consequence. And that is what held viewers through every moment, because consequence is final. It does not negotiate, it simply arrives. And as decisions were outlined and responsibilities reassigned, the sense of inevitability deepened, making it clear that the outcome was not sudden but overdue. And as the room approached its turning point, the audience could feel that something irreversible was taking shape. Not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet closing of doors that would never reopen. And what made this stage so compelling was the absence of theatrics, because without distraction, every word carried weight, every pause mattered, and every acknowledgement felt permanent. And as the final statements were delivered, the energy in the room shifted from tension to stillness, the kind of stillness that follows acceptance. And viewers stayed because they understood that the story was no longer building toward chaos, but toward clarity. And clarity is often the most powerful reveal of all, because it leaves no room for illusion. And as the session drew to a close, the sense of completion did not feel triumphant, it felt sobering, because endings that are honest rarely feel celebratory. And as individuals began to step away from the space, they were not leaving behind conflict, they were leaving behind a version of themselves shaped by compromise. And what remained was not victory, but truth. And that truth lingered with the audience long after the final words, because it challenged the idea that endurance alone equals loyalty, and reframed strength as the courage to stop participating in systems that require silence as the price of belonging. And that realization carried the narrative forward beyond the room, beyond the family, and into the viewer experience itself, ensuring that attention never wavered because the story had become personal, familiar, and impossible to dismiss. As the story moved beyond the courtroom and into its aftermath, the weight of what had occurred did not fade. It settled deeper because the real consequences of truth are rarely immediate explosions. They are slow, unmistakable shifts that ripple outward, changing relationships, identities, and futures. And what viewers began to understand was that this was never just about documents or decisions. It was about years of emotional labor finally being acknowledged and redistributed. And as the days passed, the silence that followed spoke louder than any argument ever had, because there were no more meetings to attend, no more justifications to offer, no more roles to perform. And for the first time, the absence of noise revealed how much effort had gone into maintaining an image that no longer reflected reality. And this realization held viewers because it mirrored something deeply human: the exhaustion that comes from carrying a system alone, and the relief that arrives when that burden is finally set down. And as individuals began to step into new spaces without asking permission, the narrative shifted again, away from loss and toward recalibration. Because endings are not empty, they create room, and that room began to fill with autonomy, clarity, and self-direction. And as the audience watched familiar figures navigate this transition, the story maintained its grip, not through conflict, but through transformation, because growth is compelling when it is earned. And as new paths quietly emerged, they did so without spectacle, reinforcing the idea that healing does not require an audience, and strength does not announce itself. And this phase of the story resonated deeply because it challenged the assumption that resolution must be dramatic, instead showing that sometimes the most powerful conclusion is simply choosing differently. And as viewers reflected on earlier seasons, earlier conversations, and earlier justifications, they began to see how the pieces had always been there, waiting for context, and that context now reframed everything and kept attention locked. Because reinterpretation is addictive. Once the lens changes, the entire picture follows. And as this understanding spread, it extended beyond the family itself, prompting conversations among viewers about boundaries, fairness, and the cost of silence. And that broader relevance ensured the story did not end when the courtroom emptied, because its implications continued to unfold in living rooms, comment sections, and personal reflections. And as time passed, the absence of constant reaction allowed something else to surface: accountability without spectacle, growth without validation, and closure without permission. And this evolution marked the final turn of the narrative, because it demonstrated that survival is not defined by endurance alone, but by the willingness to stop participating in systems that require self-erasure. And as that message settled, it became clear why viewers stayed until the end, because this was not just a story they watched, it was a story they recognized. And in that recognition, they found something validating, something clarifying, and something quietly empowering, ensuring that the final impression left behind was not shock or outrage, but understanding. And that understanding lingered long after the screen faded, because stories rooted in truth do not end when the video does. They continue reshaping perception, choice, and courage in ways that are both subtle and lasting. As the narrative expanded beyond the immediate legal confrontations, the ripple effects began to manifest in ways that no one could have fully anticipated, and every interaction that followed carried the weight of the courtroom revelations, because when long-held secrets are exposed, even the most routine encounters are colored by new understanding, and the Brown family itself became a microcosm of how power, trust, and perception intersect over time. And as each member recalibrated their position within the family and in the public eye, viewers could trace the evolution of influence not through overt confrontation, but through subtle adjustments in behavior and posture. Because the dynamics that once relied on unspoken agreements and habitual silence now faced scrutiny that could not be ignored. And this shift kept attention because the story was no longer confined to legal filings or financial statements. It had grown into a study of human behavior under the pressure of truth and accountability. And as social media captured fragments of reactions from the individuals involved, the audience was drawn into the broader implications of visibility and narrative control. Because every post, comment, or absence thereof served as a signal not just to other family members, but to the millions who had followed along for years. And that signaling created suspense because observers began to anticipate what the next strategic or emotional move might be, while simultaneously reassessing what had already occurred. And as the days turned into weeks, the absence of immediate spectacle allowed the more profound consequences to crystallize, and the psychological impact on those implicated in mismanaged responsibilities and hidden agendas became apparent. And viewers could see that the unraveling of a carefully maintained public persona is often more compelling than the exposure of a single act of wrongdoing, because the human cost and the subtle recalibration of relationships unfold in ways that feel immediate and tangible. And as individuals negotiated new boundaries, new responsibilities, and new relationships, the story maintained tension, not through action, but through the quiet uncertainty of what would remain intact and what would be irrevocably altered. And this type of suspense is addictive because it mirrors real life, the way trust builds or erodes slowly, and the way accountability is processed incrementally. And as families and associates of the main parties adjusted their expectations and behavior, the narrative expanded to encompass community perception, corporate oversight, and legacy management, because what started as personal confrontation now required systemic reckoning. And the audience stayed engaged because each revelation prompted a reevaluation of prior assumptions, and the ongoing recalibration created a sense of progression that was satisfying without being forced. And as the media coverage evolved, the framing shifted from sensational headlines to considered analysis, reflecting the depth and nuance of the situation. And this shift reinforced the educational aspect of the content, showing that narratives are complex and consequences multifaceted. And as the family members themselves took steps to document actions, clarify intentions, and establish transparent practices, the story illustrated the power of measured responses in contrast to impulsive reactions. And that lesson kept viewers invested because it offered insight into resilience, negotiation, and strategic planning in high-stakes environments. And as corporate and legal entities weighed in with statements, audits, and confirmations, the transparency reinforced the credibility of the unfolding story, because evidence-based reporting and documentation left little room for speculation. And as each participant internalized lessons learned and implemented structural changes, the narrative arc approached closure, not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet resolution. And the audience remained because the satisfaction derived from seeing authentic accountability and informed decision-making is profound and lasting. And as the final chapters of the story emphasized forward movement, personal integrity, and renewed autonomy, the content achieved a loop, ensuring that viewers could reflect on the full cycle of secrecy, exposure, accountability, and adaptation. And in that reflection, the story became more than entertainment. It became a case study in human behavior, systems of trust, and the enduring value of clarity in relationships and organizational structures. And as the concluding moments settled, the narrative left the audience with questions about personal responsibility, systemic integrity, and the cost of silence that would resonate long after the video ended. because the power of the story was not in temporary shock, it was in sustained contemplation and the understanding that emerges when complexity is honored and every action